Hey there everyone, and welcome to DnD Horror Stories with DnD Doge. What happens when a group has a player that secretly cheats, but then needs help making a new character for Pathfinder? Let's find out. To the story. No, you can't use mental illness to justify having two character sheets. By Reddit user DarkTortoise23. Short story about a player who used to play at my wife's table in our home games. We kicked this player out of our group a couple months ago for behavior that we thought was just a misunderstanding of 5th edition's mechanics. Small math mistakes on his character sheet whenever we checked it, giving himself higher level abilities than he should because he thought multi-classing gets you the benefits of both classes, right? Etc. That eventually scaled up to blatant, full-on cheating, fudging gold amounts, giving himself equipment that he did not purchase, and attempting to lie to other party members after he failed the save on Zone of Truth. He was never at the same table as me, so aside from checking his sheet for my wife, I never really experienced his little cheats and advantages. What stood out to me most about this player wasn't what he did at the table, but when I tried to help him make a character for a different campaign. For context, my wife runs small series of one-shots every so often to try out different systems, different group dynamics, and to let her creativity flow by working on something other than her massive 6-year-long multi-party campaign. This particular year, she wanted to try her hand at running Pathfinder 2nd edition, because the flavor of this mini-campaign was going to be very Far Cry-esque, and she wanted to have guns available. Because I love building character sheets and optimizing, my wife often relies on me to help build and check over the other players' character sheets. So there was one day after a game that I approached this player and asked him, "Hey, do you have an idea for your Far Cry character yet? If you want, I can start researching ideas for how to build them." So this player says, "Is there a way to have a split personality in Pathfinder 2nd edition?" What? He says, "I want my character to have a split personality, like where one of them has a certain set of abilities and the other has a different set." I thought that was a little insensitive to people with actual dissociative identity disorder. But at this point, the Moon Knight TV show had just come out, and that sort of character idea was sort of in vogue. At the same time though, this was his first time playing Pathfinder 2nd edition, and I wanted to steer him towards something easy to play, rather than overcomplicate things with a complicated split personality mechanic that we'd have to essentially invent whole cloth. So I thought about it, and told him, the best way to build that sort of a character would be a rogue. Rogues have a massive list of skills at first level, and are also pretty good in combat. So you can pick out what skills and feats are associated with what personality, and play it out that way. And he responds with, "No, I want two personalities to have, different stats. One is a pacifist that has really high intelligence and charisma, and has a bunch of non-combat skills and abilities. And the other is a psychopath that's geared all towards combat." Well, that hardly seems fair to the other players. I mean, even what OP suggested didn't really seem fair at all, as the player could change abilities to suit whatever situation pops up. That gave me pause, because what he had essentially told me is that he wanted to play two separate characters and swap between them as he saw fit, depending on which would be stronger for that situation. I said, "I can't sign off on that. Okaying that would be giving you two-player characters, while everyone else only has one. We can sort of work on your stats to where you can represent both on one character sheet, but you can't have two sets of abilities to pick from just because your character has DID. He seemed less interested in the character after I said that. So the game ended up getting delayed to the release of Starfinder 2nd edition, so ultimately, it never mattered. But looking back on it, It put into context why he eventually ended up getting kicked from our group. At every turn, he seemed to be hyper-concerned about his character having weaknesses, like lower armor class, or not doing as much damage as characters specialized to do damage. It seemed like he wanted his character to be able to do a little bit of everything, but became insecure when someone who specialized in any given particular thing outclassed him, like the tank with her armor class, or the cleric with his spellcasting. We found out later, from another friend he played with, that he had a history of blatant cheating in his home game, with the same warning signs and symptoms that we increasingly noticed in our games with him. It's not even optimizing or munchkinning that I could empathize with. It was just wanting to be better than other players in the party, and going through illegal methods to do it. Yeah, it just sounds like that player wanted to be the most important and powerful character. The split personality thing was an obvious ploy to try to have a character with stats that he could switch out for any situation, so he could always come out on top. Plus, it would give him a way to take the spotlight from other players by just saying, "Oh, my personality is changing because of X." It doesn't surprise me at all that OP and his wife found out this player was cheating, and with that pattern of behavior, it was probably best that they kicked him out, as that type of thing just makes the game not fun for everyone else involved. But with that, let's move on to a story where a dungeon master just can't stand for his players to succeed. To the post. Dungeon Master makes his NPC unkillable, by Reddit user AlexDragonMaster15. Context: our campaign is basically fantasy steampunk Star Wars. We've been playing this D&D campaign for about 3 months, and our DM decided at the beginning that eventually we would have to kill his merchant character. Well, tonight, we tried, and as we rolled initiative, he told us the character used 3 wish spells to be immune to all damage, to be immune to all conditions, and to make all the player characters unconscious. We managed to counterspell the wish that made us unconscious, but then some player characters used their turns to attack, and were told that they couldn't damage him. About 20 minutes later, we figured out a solution to beat him. However, anytime we find a solution to a problem he doesn't like, he tells us things that completely negate our solutions until we stumble into how he wants us to do it. i.e., we tried to sneak around, use invisibility spells and disguises to get a hold of an item we needed, and he panicked and said, "That doesn't work, because all the guards have true sight goggles, and they can see you." I've brought this to the group's attention, and I've said something in private to him about how it's frustrating, and it feels like when kids play and suddenly start saying things like, "I have laser vision." "Well, I have a shield that blocks lasers." "Well, my lasers go through your shield." "Nuh-uh." After our conversations, it feels as though nobody has listened to a thing I've said, because he keeps doing it, and nobody bats an eye. Well, that just sounds really stupid and annoying. Now, I realize that OP already sunk 3 months into this game, but at this point, with the DM just pulling things out of his backside, like 3 frickin' wish spells to make the NPC invincible, I think it might be time to write this one off, and go the no D&D is better than bad D&D route here, as it sounds like OP already tried to talk to everyone, including the DM, and nothing has come from it. I would tell OP, don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy, since you already spent 3 months on the game and end up staying. Just get out of there and find a better group if you can. Let's move on to another story, where a group hijacks a player's character and backstory, all for a joke. To the story. Dungeon Master and Player Sexualizing My Warlock's Patron, by Reddit user BlazyPoo32. So, in one of the campaigns, I play with some guys I met at the library. I play a warlock. I'm good friends with the DM, in particular. For my patron, I had a clear vision of the character, a drawing to go with it, and the rest was for the DM to decide. I kind of wish I didn't do that, because immediately, both the DM and another player just say multiple times, "Oh look, goth dommy mommy," and it just made me feel disgusted, to be honest. I thought that would be the end of it, but oh no. The DM alters her background lore, making it so that she was a hooker in the past and ran a brothel, and then one of the other players chimed in to make it so he had slept with my patron in the past. I am now stuck with this over-sexualized character now, and I don't even want to touch it anymore. Man, that's messed up. But there's a really simple solution to this. Just tell them no. That's it. Tell them that that isn't going to happen, and if they insist, that you won't be in the game. Though, even if they do decide to relent, that is a big red flag, and I wouldn't know if I could trust the DM at that point. But if OP does decide to stay, if they end up listening to her, then I would suggest demanding a session 0 to discuss things, so that that type of thing doesn't happen again. Joking around is one thing, but completely changing a player's character's background and lore for that type of thing is just childish and stupid. But with that, before we move on, could a Doge get a like for an Alice? She's so sneaky. Also, if you're feeling generous, I'll leave my Ko-Fi and Buy Me a Coffee links in the description, and if you happen to donate, I'll be sure to read your message in the next video. Though, with that said, let's get to the next post, where a player wanted to try DMing in order to give their forever DM a break. But then, said DM didn't seem to like giving away power. To the story. DM wants another person to run game, shortly declares they do not meet his standards. By Reddit user Irigo. I've just started getting my ducks in a row about DMing a game for the first time in a few years. I'm excited to get started, but the whole situation has made me recall the horror story that warded off my DMing for this long. I had been part of a campaign that had run weekly for a few months. It was an online game over Roll20, but some of us knew each other in our everyday life, generally through the DM. There was me, the then Forever DM who started the group. Let's call him Forever to reduce confusion as to who's running the game as it swaps around. And the other players, Wizard, Druid, and Ranger, who were all friends of Forever. Later, Sorcerer, a friend of mine, would join in too. We played through a short campaign, then spent some time skipping between different systems. Forever DM was pretty indecisive, as he tended to pick up games, run them for a session or two, then announce that he'd lost interest and we'd be doing something else. Generally speaking, we didn't mind that much, as we usually had fun anyways. Then, a session rolls around where Forever announces to the party that he's burned out and doesn't want to run games, and just wants to play. I had always been pretty into world building and writing, and in an effort to help, I said I'd be happy to run something during our sessions so he could take a break, and everyone seemed happy enough with that solution. Well, this turned out to be a nightmare. Now, was I an especially good DM? I can't say. I was very new to the role. I was not very good at telling players no, so I probably let people put together some fairly broken sheets. But most of the party seemed to be having a decent enough time. Forever though, he quickly became very hostile. Now, I don't mean that he critiqued things or gave me feedback. He would just sigh deeply throughout the session, mute himself for long periods and not respond on his turn, and then suddenly announce that he was leaving and drop out of the session, etc. This was increasingly stressful to me, as he would not tell me whatever his issue was. but just sigh theatrically and refuse to elaborate. Eventually, this culminated in a session where there was some silly scene I made a call on, and Forever exploded at me. He told me I was running the system wrong, was a terrible DM, and more or less, that all my ideas were stupid. As embarrassing as it was, I ended up in tears on the call. I would have been perfectly fine with changing my approach in response to some feedback, but getting publicly ripped into at the table mid-session felt absolutely horrible. The rest of the table were distinctly unimpressed with Forever, with Sorcerer and Druid both pointing out that I had stepped in to help Forever out, but he was adamant that, quote, "You need to hear criticism to improve as a DM." Well, I mean, there's criticism, but this was just blatant nastiness. Well, that worked great, as it was such an unpleasant experience that I didn't DM for literal years after. Forever's outburst angered so many players that the table fell apart shortly after that. I think he suggested returning a while later, but no one took him up on it. He's not a bad person generally, but I don't think I would play with him again. Well, I don't know about that. He seems like a bit of a dick to me. As I said, I might have sucked at what I was doing. I honestly can't remember the details of the whole thing, but there were so many ways he could have given me feedback that would have let me improve the game overall. But it felt like he just had to kind of, quote, "put me in my place" in front of the rest of the party, with disastrous results. I'm finally putting myself back in the DM's chair after all of that, and I will admit, some part of me is still nervous and insecure over the whole thing, but I don't want to let one bad experience dictate everything going forward. Yeah, it sounds to me like the DM just didn't like the idea of OP being a DM, even though he wanted to be a player. Sure, OP could have been making some mistakes, but it was OP's first time running a game. But instead of helping OP and being polite about it, he just had to be nasty. So it is no surprise that when he wanted to run another game, that no one was interested after that outburst. Though at least this didn't permanently prevent OP from getting into the DM seat, and they are about to give it another go. So here's hoping that OP runs a great game, and everyone involved has a great time. But with that, it looks like we have time for one more story, where a DM can't tell whether or not a player is enjoying the game, and needs some advice. To the post. Player seems to hate the game, but doesn't want to stop playing? By Reddit user Jakin245. I don't know if this is really fitting for the subreddit, since it's a bit more of a question, but I thought it was the best place for it. I'm running a campaign with a few players currently, and there's one player who I've been getting increasingly strong vibes that he hates how things are going, but still shows up and insists that he's interested. The party consists of Rogue, who loves stealing and has zero morals, Fighter, who is dopey with a kill first, ask questions never mindset, Bard, who loves the limelight and trolling NPCs, Warlock, who is a stereotypical nerdy quote-unquote joke character, and finally Cleric, who is basically a quote average Joe, friendly helpful guy. As you could expect, the group is fairly murder-hobo-y, morally gray at best, with the exception of Cleric. He comes to clash with the Rogue stealing things, or Fighter's insistence on solving problems with violence. This is all fine, or at least it was for a while, but I feel like it's really starting to bother him out of character as well as in character, but he refuses to admit it for some reason. For example, the party ends up tying up some mildly hostile farmers who are, at the end of the day, just trying to defend themselves and their land. Rogue gets more and more bold with stealing from the farm, eventually doing it straight in front of the tied up farmers while mocking them, and Cleric scolds them in what turns into a minor out-of-character rant about how insane Rogue is. No one is actually bothered by this. Rogue laughs about it and enjoys that he's acknowledging that her character is a POS. Another time, Bard is basically the, quote, negotiator in a hostage situation. For whatever reason, they decide they're going to try and use a bunch of various magics and tricks to be funny and mess with the hostage takers. Nothing they were doing was at all helpful or even sensible. Whispering insults into their ears, making random mirages, etc. It was a massive time waste, and ultimately resulted in Bard getting shot at to try and get it to move along. They still refused, prompting Cleric to basically start yelling, semi-in character, to stop effing around. I say semi-in character because while the words were the characters, the anger was the players. And he was totally right, by the way. Everyone was getting sick of the holdup for what was essentially nothing. And finally, we moved on. I've noticed Cleric getting more and more upset over the party's various shenanigans, in character and out of character, and I've asked him about it privately. I remember he had a bit of a rant that he disliked how over-the-top, quote-unquote quirky, Warlock kept acting. And I specifically asked him privately whether it actually bothered him. He said that he didn't actually mind at all, that it was just his character that was upset, not him. But as we keep going, I feel like that's less and less true. The thing is, he isn't really in the wrong. The rogue is a loot goblin. The fighter kills for basically no reason. The warlock is gimmicky. And the bard does try to take the spotlight a bit too often. It's a Murderhobo Party, but everyone else is still having fun and laughing at the ridiculous antics and situations, seemingly aside from him. His answers keep getting shorter, he doesn't engage nearly as much, and his responses about showing up to sessions are starting to feel passive-aggressive. But he still shows up every session, seemingly just to get upset at the party that he knows are a bunch of fools, blundering their way through the world. What do I do? Cleric is clearly enjoying himself less and less, for entirely fair reasons, over the party's ridiculous behavior, but the other players are all for it. He doesn't ruin the atmosphere for them either. They seem to have fun with him losing his mind over their craziness. But I can feel he's getting closer and closer to a breaking point. Well, first of all, I would tell OP that they have to take into consideration that they may be reading too much into things. Perhaps Cleric really doesn't have an issue with the way the game is going, and him seeming like he's enjoying the game less and less is just circumstantial, as he could just be having other issues going on in his life. I mean, you basically did all you could, or can do as a DM, and talked with him directly about the issue, and asked if things are bothering him. At this point, you kind of gotta take him at his word, and if things seem to just get worse, and he starts affecting the fun of the other players with outbursts or something like that, then that would need to be addressed. But you have to take into consideration that perhaps Cleric is just really into the roleplay, to the point that you may be reading something where there's nothing to be read. I mean, I know this is anecdotal, but ironically enough, in my game, our cleric is always annoyed with my rogue and our bard's antics, and he has had to make a point a few times that his character was getting annoyed, but he was loving the roleplay. Though, sadly, that dynamic is no longer going to be there, as his cleric died in our last session while fighting a fiend. Though we are level 14 now, so things are starting to get a lot harder. But I digress. Anyway, that's all the advice I could give. Just trust your players. After all, trust and communication are both key parts of a successful tabletop RPG like Dungeons & Dragons. Though what kind of advice would you give OP here? Be sure to post it in the comments. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope that your games remain horror story free. Until next time.